money, your stories, your freedom. The Peter Schiff Show.
Welcome, everybody. This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com, and we are once again taking calls, 855-4-SCHIFF, 855-4-SCHIFF. We'll be discussing the markets, politics, the economy. The stock market's off to a relatively strong start today. I think the Dow was up 100 points just a minute ago. Now it's only up about 80. But it's doing a lot better than the precious metals market, which, again, is down today, although nothing spectacular. But we had a rally earlier this morning. Gold's now down about $10 on the GLD. Silver, percentage-wise, even weaker, almost down $1. And gold stocks also down just under 1%. Dollar relatively flat. Same thing with bonds. We did get one piece of economic data out this morning on durable goods orders, which I guess increased the most in 3 months, although they're still at relatively low levels. I think the market reacted positively to that announcement, which came at around 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. But other than that, there's no major news out there. The markets are just trading. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the news that's come out, non-market related. Healthcare costs, and the numbers really are amazing. The report showed that healthcare costs for employers rose 9% in the most recent year, which is pretty par for the course. I provide health care to employees at my companies, and, I look at the cost, and the cost just escalates incredibly. But, again, 9% up this year, but it's the fastest rise in 6 years. And it's now costing companies $15,000 per year to provide a family with insurance. Now, think about that, $15,000 a year. I mean, that's more than $1,000 a month. What is that? Maybe my head, maybe $1,200 a month, something like that. I mean, a lot of families don't pay $1,200 a month in rent. So for a lot of families, then, health care insurance costs more than their rent. I mean, this is crazy. And, of course, the study actually estimates, and it's probably wrong, but the estimate is that by 2021, which is 10 years from now, that it's going to cost $30,000 per household for health insurance. And, of course, this isn't even all the costs. This is just the costs that the companies are picking up. It doesn't include, I don't believe, the costs that the employers are paying on their own. And it certainly doesn't include, co-pays or deductibles or things like that, or if the employee just goes and buys, routine over-the-counter, cold and flu medicines or stuff like that. So the total cost for medical care is higher. This is a disgrace that we're spending so much money on health care, on health insurance. And why is it? Why is it that we're spending so much more on health insurance, yet we're spending less money on other things like a television set or a cell phone? And again, the reason it's so much more expensive is because the government is so involved. And unfortunately, with Obamacare, the government's about to get even more involved. And so that's going to twist the cost curve even more in the direction of higher costs. There should really be a lot more outrage, I guess, in the media just behind how big this number is. And if families are spending $15,000 a year just on health care, what are they going without? How do you save for your retirement? How do you put money away if it's costing you so much every month just for the health insurance? Speaking about, I mentioned the word twist. Speaking about Operation Twist, I was reading an article where they interviewed a Fed Fisher, from the Federal Reserve. He's one of the guys who voted against Operation Twist. He's one of the dissenters. Richard Fisher is the guy's name. And I read all of the reasons that Richard Fisher listed as why he was against Operation Twist. And it's pretty much like you read my commentary. He had many of the same objections that I had regarding the effects on the banks, that it would backfire, that it jeopardized the Fed's balance sheet by putting them in a weaker position, making it higher to shrink the balance sheet and raise rates, all very legitimate criticisms, which I'm sure behind the scenes he was giving to the Fed, and the Fed, of course, chose to ignore him, as well as the other two critics who dissented. But generally what happens is the dissenters end up falling in line and following the majority down the wrong path. Although it's also interesting, I read an article, a different article on Fisher, in which he was pointing out the fact that, the Fed is now under attack from both sides, both the left and the right. And the right, he's talking about Ron Paul, and the left was Barney Frank. But what's interesting is the way his quote. I'm going to quote from what Fisher said. He said, quote, "I don't see any difference between Frank and Paul." Really? You don't see any difference between Barney Frank and Ron Paul? He says, quote, "They believe we have too much independence. They believe that Congress should be in charge of monetary policy." No, they don't. That's not what they believe. Ron Paul wants, to the extent that he wants the Federal Reserve at all, he wants it to be independent. He just wants it to be audited. But he wants their decisions to be independent of Congress. He doesn't want them to act as an arm of the U.S. Treasury, which is exactly what they're doing. Frank and Paul are both criticizing the Fed. But that's where the similarity ends. I can't believe that Dick Fisher can't see the difference between the two types of criticism. Barney Frank is criticizing the Fed because he thinks they're too loose. Because he thinks they're too tight, excuse me. He wants even cheaper money. He thinks the Fed isn't paying enough attention to unemployment and that it's too fixated on inflation. Paul's the opposite. Paul says, no, the Fed is too easy. We don't want them paying attention to unemployment at all. Trash that Phillips curve. The Fed should be worried about the value of the dollar. Inflation should be their only objective. So it's polar opposites. But he thinks all criticism is the same. It's not the same. And believe me, Ron Paul doesn't want Congress to be in charge of monetary policy. Maybe Barney Frank would want that to happen. But Ron Paul, he's the last person that the last institution that Ron Paul would want to have their hand on the printing press would be Congress. Maybe the White House. I'm not sure which of the two he might find more objectionable. But clearly that's not what Ron Paul wants. Normally when you get criticism of the Federal Reserve, the criticism is because they're too tight. They're the party pooper. They get criticized for taking away the punch bowl. But that's not what happens. Ron Paul is actually criticizing the Fed for spiking the punch bowl. Normally, the people at the party want the punch bowl spiked. They don't criticize the guy pouring the alcohol. They criticize the guy trying to take it away. And that is a big distinction, and it's unfortunate that it seems to be lost on Richard Fisher. Anyway, hey, stick around. We've got a lot more of the Peter Schiff Show coming up on SchiffRadio.com, so don't go away.
The Peter Schiff Show. To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America, we're sorry. Peter Schiff is back on the air.
This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. If you want to call it, 855-4-SCHIFF, 855-4-SCHIFF. The stock market rally is fading quickly. The Dow now barely hanging on to positive territory. The S&P and the NASDAQ are already in the red. Pressure still on the metals markets. Gold now off about $13 on the ETF. Silver down over $1. Again, volatility still the order of the day here in the markets. No, in addition to the comments by Fisher, I was also want to comment on something that Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner said on ABC News yesterday. And it's really irresponsible what Geithner is talking about. He's trying to encourage us to borrow money simply because it's cheap. This is a direct quote from Geithner. He says, quote, "We can borrow money for 10 years as the government of the United States because people have confidence in this country at less than 2%, referring to the yield on the 10-year Treasury being just under 2%. Quote, "The responsible path now is to take advantage of the unique position we're in as a country." Okay, so the responsible thing to do is to borrow money? How is borrowing more money somehow now labeled responsible? Right? No, what would be responsible would be to resist the temptation to borrow all that cheap money and to save instead. He's basically saying, hey, they're giving out free crack. Let's smoke as much as we can because, after all, it's free. You should be smart enough to not take that bait. It's like, during the housing bubble when they had all the teaser rates and people said, hey, I really can't afford this house, but I got a teaser rate, so I'm going to borrow the money anyway. That's what Geithner is saying. Because, see, all this money has to be paid back, right? We got to pay it all back. And what makes matters worse, the Fed's not borrowing for 10 years. They're ignoring the 2% 10-year money. Instead, they're borrowing at 25 basis points for 90 days or 1 year. That's what they're doing. So how is this policy, what's going to be the consequence when interest rates go up? Then that's when it hits the fan. That's when we realize how reckless we were, not responsible. It's not responsible to go into debt. And, of course, what are we doing with this borrowed money? We're just blowing it. It's not really being invested. And now the public has to pay it back. When we go deeper into debt, we're putting a bigger burden on the American economy. A lot of people agree right now that the problem is there's too much debt. Why aren't Americans spending? They have too much debt. Well, how is going deeper into debt going to help the situation? It's going to make it worse because the government's debt is the people's debt. Whatever the government owes, the people owe because the government can only get the money from the people. That's it. I mean, it can get it different ways. It can tax them, or it can borrow from them, or it can print and steal their purchasing power. But either way, whatever the U.S. government owes, the American public owes. And so if we've already got too much debt, certainly the responsible thing to do isn't to heap even more debt onto an already overly indebted country. And, of course, it's not just the debt. It's all the new regulations that he's passing. It's very interesting. There was an interview with the CEO of Coca-Cola, and he had some very interesting things to say about the United States, in particular, contrast the United States to China in talking about how much more business-friendly he found China to be than the U.S. And, of course, not too long ago, Coca-Cola tried to buy out this fruit juice company, and the Chinese government basically stymied it. Although the U.S. government, stymies mergers and acquisitions all the time. Look what they're doing with AT&T and Sprint. But despite the fact that Coca-Cola had this bad experience with that, takeover, the CEO still said that China had a much more business-friendly environment than America. I mean, those are some pretty profound words coming from the CEO of an iconic American company like Coca-Cola. I mean, how can communist China be more business-friendly than America? I mean, if words like that coming from a Coca-Cola don't send some kind of chill down the spines of Congress that we are more anti-business than China, that there's more respect for business and for free markets in what is supposedly a communist country than what is supposedly a capitalist country. But the problem is, we're not capitalist anymore. See, Michael Moore, I played that sound yesterday. Michael Moore doesn't understand that. He's criticizing capitalism, but we don't have it. He's defending capitalism without knowing it because what he's defending is America's past. And in the past, we were capitalistic. We're not anymore. It'd be like trying to say how great communism is and pointing to China as an example of why communism works. Well, China is no more communist than America is capitalist. Yes, there are some elements of communism still in China, just like there are some elements of capitalism still in America, but you got to dig pretty deep to find them. But the problem is you cannot defend communism by pointing to China, because if anything, China shows that communism doesn't work, because it wasn't until they abandoned the tenets of communism back in the 70s that the economy started to grow, that they started to have the prosperity that they had today. China is an example of why more freedom and less government intervention is what leads to prosperity and economic growth. We're an example of the reverse. We came from a situation where we had all this freedom and minimal government, and now we have a lot of government and a lot less freedom, and look at the disastrous consequences for the American economy. And part of the problem is we can't see all the disasters because we've papered it over. We're living now on borrowed time because of all this debt. But when this debt bubble bursts, when the dollar collapses, when the world comes to its senses and stops propping us up, that's when we're really going to see the harm that these policies have brought on the America. That's what we're really going to get these chickens to come home to roost and appreciate the gravity of this situation. Hey, we're going to go to the phones. If you want to call up, again, we still have plenty of open lines. 855-4-SCHIF is the number to call if you want to come into the show. We don't have a guest coming up until the top of the second hour, so plenty of time to get to your questions. Anyway, first up is Tony calling from Las Vegas. Tony, you're on.
Hey, Peter, what's up? I have a question about natural gas. I was reading that oil has about 6 times the energy output of natural gas, and it's traded at a ratio of 6 to about 10 to 1 in history. Right now, we're at 22. Does that ratio have to come down, or can it stay at that level for years? Because of the supply that's out.
I don't know. I mean, I have no idea, how long that ratio will be. But I do think that natural gas prices are cheap, certainly relative to energy, and I think they are going to eventually rise, because I think what is going to happen is that as the global economy picks up and as the dollar contracts, a lot of oil is going to be exported. A lot of oil that we used to import is going not to be imported, and a lot of our refined products, gasoline and things like that, are going to be exported. And so we're going to have to rely a lot more on domestic natural gas. And so I think that the prices are going to come up as oil prices rise, and we're forced to look for alternatives, because you don't have, oil is much easier to export and sell all around the market. Natural gas is more of a local market, and so it's going to be something that Americans are ultimately going to be relying on more as an energy source. And when they do, of course, the prices are going to be higher. Anyway, hey, I don't know if you have a follow-up question. If you want, hang on during the break. We will be right back with more of the Peter Schiff Show and taking more phone calls, 855-4-SCHIF. So stick around.
Me, with your silent brand new sneakers, your reflection I did not see. It was the hottest day in August. We were heading for the sea. For a second my mind stopped drifting.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Around me.
We now return to the Peter Schiff Show.
Call in now, 855-4-SCHIF.
That's 855-472-4433.
Rebel Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. And we are taking your phone calls at 855-4-SCHIFF. We said we don't have a guest coming up until the top of the second hour, so we still have plenty of time for people to call in and not have to hold through the guest. Anyway, still on hold now is Tony calling from Las Vegas. Tony, did you have a follow-up on your energy question?
I want to mention, last week you had a caller that talked about that poker online Ponzi scheme where people lost, $300-400 million. He said it happened because of no regulation. Actually, he was wrong. If the government, if the United States government legalized internet gambling, companies like that never would have existed, because companies like Wynn and Harrah's and MGM would have had their own online poker site, and everyone would have used them. And these little smaller companies in the middle of nowhere in the Bahamas or Costa Rica couldn't even open. So the fact that they're trying to regulate it the fact that the government's trying to regulate the internet game by not making it legal is costing people hundreds of millions of dollars in all these Ponzi schemes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Because, see, the best protection for the consumer is a vibrant free market, is to have a lot of competitors vying for business, vying for reputation. And what regulations do is it limits competition. It makes it difficult for businesses to come into existence. And so you get a less robust competitive market, and people depend then on regulators. And you're right. I mean, certainly if it was very easy, if it was wide open, the big firms would be in this, and people would just go to their sites because they would have a brand that they trusted. And, you know, more than that, I have a good client of mine who also listens to this show, who is a professional poker player, online poker player. He's not, you know, he doesn't even go to the casinos, but they made this illegal not too long ago, and I think he moved to Scandinavia. He actually had to leave the country so he wouldn't be breaking the law. But, you know, why does the government care if people are playing poker on the internet? You know, I mean, if you can get in a car and go to Atlantic City and play poker, or you can go to Vegas, or in California, you can play. There are all kinds of poker places, casinos where you can play poker. So if you can drive someplace and play poker, why can't you do it on the internet? I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous that the government's going to say it's illegal. But just because the government bans something doesn't mean it's going to stop. Look, it's illegal to smoke pot, but people are still smoking it. All sorts of drugs are illegal. People do it anyway. Prostitution is illegal in most of the country, yet people still do it. So the government doesn't eliminate an activity by making it illegal, but what it does do is it generally drives up the cost, drives down the quality, creates all sorts of unintended consequences, like with the war on drugs. Drugs are still legal, but now you got all this organized crime. You've got all the violence now associated with drugs. If drugs were legal, there would be no crime. There would be no violence. It's only because they're illegal, and all you need to do is look at prohibition. How many people are getting shot today over beer? Over wine or no. I mean, there's no gang violence over beer. People aren't dying in the streets. Our young kids aren't being corrupted into a life of crime. To liquor, but they were at one point. They were when liquor was illegal. Money came from for. Just go watch Boardwalk Empire. I mean, that's what actually gave birth to organized crime. I mean, as soon as they made liquor illegal, it was boom time for the criminal element. That was their heyday in this country during Prohibition. So the government. Maybe there was a drinking problem before Prohibition, but when they instituted Prohibition, they didn't get rid of the drinking problem. They just layered a crime problem on top of the drinking problem. And the irony of it is, if you look at the statistics, alcohol during Prohibition, by making it illegal, they made it more desirable. People wanted to do it because they couldn't. It was hip. There were actually more speakeasies in Manhattan during Prohibition than bars before Prohibition. Did I lose the caller?
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it's
yeah.
It's just another example of the government costing money when they're trying to help them. So it's as far as casino.
Yeah, and it's all about politics. It's all politics because I remember when I was running here in Connecticut, and some of my critics tried to resurrect some of my old comments from where I talked about the fact that drugs should be legal. And I remember during the convention when I was trying to get my percentage, one of the ways that the McMahon campaign tried to prevent me from getting 15% of the vote is they were spreading all this stuff about, hey, Peter Schiff wants to legalize drugs. Peter Schiff wants to legalize drugs. And all of this was like a big thing, and that's like a big no-no. He wants to legalize drugs, as if, I didn't even make legalizing drugs a point on my campaign. It wasn't on my website. I mean, I wasn't campaigning on it, so it wasn't a high priority for me. Yes, I do understand that drug laws are doing a lot of damage, and the country would be much better off without it, but I had bigger fish that I wanted to fry. But the mere idea that I would be in favor of this was so poisonous to Republicans that it would cause them not to vote for me. The problem is I'm not in favor of people doing drugs. And I don't want people to do drugs. I just recognize the fact that the war on drugs doesn't stop people from doing drugs. Remember in Ron Paul's, one of those earlier debates, Ron Paul said, how many of you would do heroin if it were legal? I'm not doing heroin, not because it's illegal, but because I don't want to do it. I mean, if I wanted to do heroin, I could get some. It's not like the laws are going to stop me. So I don't want to do it because I know it's wrong to do it. It's not because the government is preventing me from doing it. But the problem is the people that are doing heroin are doing it anyway. But the fact that it's illegal means they have to buy it from a criminal. They have to buy it from a gangster. And because they have to do that, and because the gangster is operating outside the law, it costs a lot of money. And because it's so expensive, now the heroin addict has to go and rob my house in order to afford to buy the heroin, when if it was legal, at least he wouldn't have to steal from me. At least he could buy his heroin without stealing from me or other people. And in the meantime, who is he buying it from? He's buying it on the streets, corrupting our youth in the inner cities. Wouldn't it be better if he could buy it with a prescription, in a hospital or a doctor's office or something like that? I mean, that'd be a lot better. And of course, the drugs would be a lot purer. I mean, one of the big problems is all the impurities that it's cut with. I mean, the addicts are in much worse shape because they're ingesting or using illegal heroin. It would be a lot better, if they used a pure legal heroin. And of course, if somebody had to get a prescription to go to a doctor to get heroin, at least the doctor could try to talk you out of it. Because say, well, why do you want to use this? Of course, the pusher doesn't want to talk you out of it. When you're buying it on the streets, they do everything they can to cultivate that addiction, because that's the source of their profit. So, but the problem is that when you're not tough on drugs by saying we want zero tolerance, war on drugs, the spin is that that you're in favor of drugs, that you want people to do drugs. No, it's just the opposite. But again, it's just like the liberal policies on all the social policies, like the minimum wage law, right? If you're against the minimum wage law, you want workers to be exploited. You want people to earn small amounts of money. You don't care about people. The people that say I want a minimum wage law, yeah, it all sounds great. Yes, we're gonna make sure that everybody gets paid at least a certain amount of money, but they don't connect the dots and realize that how much harm the law does. Well, it's the same thing with the war on drugs, and I don't know why more conservatives who can understand the problems with the minimum wage law don't understand the problems with the drug laws. They don't understand that by the war on drugs doesn't end the drug problem. It actually compounds it and makes it a criminal problem. And, of course, a lot of the problems at the border, a lot of the people who are so anti-immigration, get tough on immigrants, one of the big problems with violence on our borders is because of the drug laws and the drug profits that are available if you from there. So if we legalize drugs, a lot of these border violence problems that people are so against in the Republican Party who want to get tough on immigration, a lot of those problems would go away. But they can't see that. They can't get beyond the idea that, that somehow if we legalize it, we're condoning it and we're sending a message to our kids. No, we're not. Again, when the Republicans, conservatives, believe in individual responsibility, they believe that the families should be able to make decisions for themselves and their kids without government. Well, why is it different for drugs? Why don't we trust American parents to tell their kids not to do drugs? I mean, just because something is legal doesn't mean you should do it. I mean, there are things that are legal that are not good for you. I mean, we don't tell our kids to just eat nothing but junk food. We want them to eat healthy food. Yeah, it's perfectly legal to eat nothing but candy and ice cream and drink soda pop, and that's not illegal. But we don't do it. We don't encourage our kids to do that. There are a lot of things that we try to instill good values in our kids, and drugs would be no exception to that. Anyways, did I lose my caller?
No, I'm here. What's your opinion on Judge Napolitano saying that drunk driving laws are wrong. If you're drinking and driving, you're hurting other people. Isn't the libertarian view that you could do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt other people? Why would he want to take the drunk driving laws off the books?
Well, first of all, the drunk driving laws are on the books at a state level. I would certainly be against any federal laws against drunk driving. It is something that should be done on the local level. And, I am not opposed because, you are driving on public roads. I mean, these are not private roads. These are roads that are paid for by local taxes. And I think that the government can put restrictions on what you do when you're using the public roads. And they can say you can't drive drunk, you can't drive under the influence of marijuana. If they want to force you, a seatbelt is a little different because I don't think you're potentially injuring somebody else. But I think I have no problem with laws against drunk driving. I see the libertarian point in that, well, what there might be somebody out there that can drive very good drunk. And why not just punish him if he actually does something? But here I think an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. But I definitely want to see stuff like that done at the local level, not at the national level. Anyway, hey, stick around. We got a lot more coming up on the Peter Schiff Show on SchiffRadio.com.
And the streets no place to be, but there you are.
The Peter Schiff Show.
So you're down, or you're down. No one really gives a good damn.
Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million.
Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. And, final thoughts I was just thinking on this whole, the war on drugs. I mean, one of the big problems, too, is, what happens to the inner cities, the role models that are set for young kids grown up in these poor communities. I mean, it's the drug dealers that are driving the fancy cars that got all the bling. I mean, that's who a lot of these young kids are looking up to. And unfortunately, some of the most entrepreneurial people growing up in the inner cities, where do they go? Where do they take their talents? They into the drug trade because that's where the money is, because if they go into a legitimate business, they've got all kinds of government rules and regulations that they have to follow. Hey, it's wide open in the drug trade. I mean, obviously there are no regulations there. They're already breaking the law. So that's it. Once you're involved in illegal activity, you don't have to worry about the regulators or anything like that. And of course, one of the reasons that there's so much violence associated with drugs is because there is no legal framework within which the drug dealers can operate. So if a drug dealer, if he buys $10,000 worth of drugs from somebody, and the guy shortchanges them, maybe the quality isn't what it was supposed to be, or the quantity isn't there. It's not like he could go to court and sue. I mean, there's no legal remedy. All they could do is shoot him. I mean, that's what happens. And in fact, one of the reasons that there is so much violence, and they want, if they are going to kill somebody, they want to kill them in a way that, maybe that shows that it was very painful, because they want to send a message to all their other potential business transaction people, or whoever's on the other side of their deals. Hey, don't screw with us. Make sure and deliver what you're promised, or don't screw us over on money, because look what we do to the people that don't pay us or that cheat us. I mean, that's what happens, and that's why you get so much violence and organized crime, because they have to make a point through that intimidation and fear, because that's all they have. I mean, there's no other legal recourse. So all of this stuff would end, all the violence, the crime. Not only the crime that is, committed by the drug lords and the gangs themselves, but more importantly, the crime committed against people who don't even use drugs by people who need money to buy drugs. And that's where the majority of the crime in America comes from. And think about all the resources, all the police resources that are wasted waging the war on drugs. Imagine if we can use that money more productively someplace else. Hey, something very interesting I wanted to play. I've got some sound. Apparently Ford Motor, Ford is the only big three auto company that did not get bailed out directly by the U.S. government. I mean, ultimately they might have been bailed out indirectly by, cheap money and a lot of things the government is doing But they didn't get specifically bailed out, like General Motors and Chrysler. And, you got to at least respect them for that and tip the hat to the fact that, hey, at least one company survived. But in any event, Ford tried to capitalize, rightfully so, on the goodwill that they should have because they didn't get bailed out. And they had an ad focusing on people wanting to buy Ford cars, specifically costs they didn't want to buy from a bailout company. And they ended up pulling the ad because the Obama administration asked them to. I guess they asked kind of nicely. And so they pulled the ad. I have a little sound from the Ford ad. Here's cut number 2.
I'm Kristen. We're going to head on into the interview.
Chris, was it buying American important to you?
I wasn't going to buy another car that was bailed out by our government. I was going to buy from a manufacturer that's standing on their own, win, lose, or draw. That's what America's about, is taking the chance to succeed and understanding when you fail that you got to pick yourself up and go back to work. Ford is that company for me.
Yeah, I mean, nothing wrong. I think it was actually kind of tame. I think they could have hit him a little harder on the bailouts. But anyway, that was their marketing strategy, and they turned it down. I mean, so the thing is, we have to have a right to complain about what the government does. So not only didn't Ford take a bailout, but now the government is saying, hey, you can't use that fact that you didn't get a bailout. You can't use that somehow as an advantage. So in other words, what they're trying to do is they're trying to send a message to other companies that if you do get bailed out, if you do take a government bailout, we'll make sure that your competitors don't try to use that fact against you. They want to remove the stigma from a bailout. I mean, Ford is trying to capitalize on the fact that some Americans might be upset that these companies took bailout money. And what the government wants to do is make sure that that stigma is not there. No. We don't want anybody to remind people that they were bailed out. It's kind of like saying that, hey, if you go bankrupt, we shouldn't allow the bankruptcy to be on your credit record. I mean, a lot of times people don't go bankrupt specifically because they don't want to hurt their credit score. Well, what if we made it illegal to even include a bankruptcy as part of a credit score? What if going bankrupt had absolutely no impact on your credit score? Well, a lot more people would go bankrupt. I think if we allow companies to criticize their competitors who get bailed out by the government, well, maybe, just maybe, companies will be less likely to put themselves in a position where they need to be bailed out because they'll fear the backlash. If we try to silence the critics, then we simply invite more companies to be willing to participate in a bailout. And so that's this concept of moral hazard that the government never seems to understand, that there are consequences when the government acts. When the government steps in and does something, that people change their behavior based on the government. It's kind of like the sci-fi, science fiction movies where there's time travel, and it's always like, well, if you travel in time and then you do something to screw up the timeline, your being there alters the flow of time. Well, when the government comes into a market, even if they see a problem and they say, well, here's how many unemployed people there are, and if we pass this law, this is what it's going to cost. It's based on how the country looks, how the market looks before the law is passed. What they don't take into consideration is the impact of the law itself, how it changes the dynamics, how it changes incentives and behaviors, and so that the problem ends up being bigger, and that's why government programs often cost, one of the reasons why they cost so much more than they initially budget, because the program itself creates more demand for the money, and so there's a bigger need, and so the program ends up costing more. Anyway, hey, that's it. Stick around. We've got a guest coming up after the break. We've got another hour coming up on the Peter Schiff Show on SchiffRadio.com, so stick around.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Make no
friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. One minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans, and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on.
Call in now. 855-4-SHIP.
That's 855-472-4433.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories,
your freedom.
The Peter Schiff Show.
And this is Peter Schiff, Hour 2, SchiffRadio.com, underway. Now, joining me is my guest, Stephen Smith. And Stephen is a real estate developer, investor in New York City and in Chicago. And he also blogs on a website, marketurbanism.com. He's a graduate from Georgetown University, 2010. He actually speaks quite a few languages, Romanian, French, German, and Spanish. We're just going to talk English because that's all I know. Anyway, Stephen, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi. I'm actually not a developer. It was Adam who started the blog as a developer. If I were a developer, I would probably not make very much money because I have a little too many principles for that.
Develop? I don't know. But you are a real estate investor.
No. I'm pretty young. Adam, who started the blog, was a developer out of New York. He works for a pretty big politically connected development firm, which is, I think, where he got a lot of these ideas. He saw how sort of the sausage was made there, and he was a really big Austrian, and then I sort of started taking it over. And I'm a journalist. I write. I sort of started writing about it. But I got a lot of inspiration from his ideas, working in the trenches of New York City real estate. I think one of the things I learned the best thing I learned from him was that, when it comes to big city real estate, you don't make money by being innovative. You make money by having connections to, the zoning board, whoever can get your, parcel approved, your project approved. So,
yeah, a lot of that's definitely true. In real estate, you got to grease a lot of palms. So a lot of it is knowing the right people, having the right connections, and that's part of the problem with politics on all levels is people sell their influence, and that's one of the reasons that people go into politics, not so much to collect a paycheck that they earn, but everything they get under the table and through other kinds of perks by being able to sell the influence that they have. By being in some type of a public capacity where, they can say yes or no to a project or a zoning change or something like that.
Right, yeah. And this happens on all levels. We focus on urban real estate, which is not something that a lot of libertarians focus on. The general libertarian line that you hear from people like, Cato Reason is that, the U.S. government has been pushing against cars all these years, and, we don't really agree. I think if you really look at the history of urbanism transportation, America used to have a, pretty vibrant system of private trains. Most of the New York subway system was built by the government. However, the elevated trains that came before it were not. They were sort of regulated out of existence. The whole city was really regulated.
I think the subways were originally private. They became public.
Well,
I think they started.
The elevated trains were private, and then they wanted to replace the elevated trains with subways. They were contracted by private companies. However, they're subject to a lot of price controls. You couldn't charge more than a 5-cent fare for them. There was some. They were quasi-public, quasi-private, less private than the elevated trains that came before them. Were actually much more extensive. New York City's been working on the Second Avenue subway for about 80 years. The Second Avenue had an elevated train about 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. But, that's just one of many things. It's actually impossible to build a building nowadays outside of a dense city core without building tons of parking. That's another thing we focus a lot on. In this country, you're not really, rightly so, you're not entitled to health care, you're not entitled to a lot of these things, but you are entitled to parking in America. Pretty much everywhere.
Well, anyway, so what is there a definition of urbanism? Is it something? I mean, is that a term you've coined, or is it in a dictionary?
No, I mean, it's in a dictionary. There's urbanism right now. It tends to be a very left-leaning field. You might have heard of Jane Jacobs. She was one of the first, people to really take that term and run with it. She was. She never described herself as a libertarian, but a lot of libertarians have sort of adopted her. Her ideas, she was very anti a lot of the big redevelopment projects that were happening in cities around the 50s and 60s, the highway projects that were using eminent domain to take people's land, and then, to take a lot of, not only for highways, but for, big projects. The World Trade Center was a big one. Anytime you go into a center city core and you see a huge concrete plaza, you can bet that there was some redevelopment there. And that was, Jane Jacobs pushed the idea of, mixed-use development, these sorts of things, which are very money-making for developers. However, have been sort of recently they've come back, but they were sort of pushed out of the mainstream in the 50s and 60s when the idea was, the government.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people too, when you think about the problems in the cities, you always think about low cost housing and why don't we have more of that? And I think the big problem is government involvement. I mean, government comes in not only when you have rent controls. I mean, when you're living in an environment where you have rent control, it makes it a very scary proposition to invest your capital in building something when you don't have when you can't determine what the rents are going to be, and when you can be held hostage to a government bureaucrat who might force you to rent your property out at a level that actually causes you to lose money.
Right, and I mean, rent control is one of the very few ideas that's pretty much opposed by nearly all economists. You can read on the blog, you can read some great quotes from some socialist economists about rent control from Paul Krugman. They're all against it, or at least let's say you want to build a tower in the Chelsea neighborhood of New York, which is a very hot up-and-coming neighborhood. You have to devote anywhere from 20 to New York City. It sometimes gets up to 50% of your units to essentially rent-controlled housing. They call them affordable units. So it's making a comeback.
Yeah, and actually, what rent control ends up doing is it's like the government confiscating private property from the owner and simply giving it to the renter. Because if you have the right, if you can rent an apartment for far below its fair market value, it almost becomes an asset. I mean, these are assets that are coveted. If you have children, you can leave the property to your children, and often the siblings might fight over who gets the rent-controlled apartment because it's such a valuable asset. Sometimes people who have rent control legally, you can still take in a roommate. So potentially, if you're living in a two-bedroom apartment, you might have a rent-controlled apartment where your rent is $1,000. Your roommate could be paying you $3,000 under the table, or I don't even know, and you're still there. And some people actually, don't even live in their rent-controlled apartments. They move out and maybe, they let somebody else live there. They sublease them. Of course, the landlords are always trying to prove that their tenants are not there. If they're not, they're trying to hire private investigators because, if you do something wrong, you can get kicked out and you can lose a rent-controlled apartment, in which case the owner of the apartment can then raise the rent to, a fair market level.
Right, and in New York City, it's so perverted that you can actually legally qualify for a rent-controlled apartment if you have $1 billion in assets but don't earn any income. I believe the income limit is, now they just upped to $300,000 a year, so you can earn, you can have all of that in assets and not ever be...
Well, I don't think the rent control, does rent control have anything to do with your income? I mean, if you live in a rent-controlled apartment, can the rent controls be lifted if your income goes up?
There is something called... luxury decontrol. So if the rent-controlled rent goes above $3,000 in New York City, now that's the rent-controlled rent, not the market rate rent. So, a $3,000 rent-controlled apartment might actually be worth $10,000 a month. So if you earn more than $300,000 in a year and your rent-controlled rent is above $3,000, then it becomes decontrolled. However, that's very rare. And a lot of times what will happen, you mentioned the landlord's hiring detectives and stuff. Sometimes they'll figure it's not even worth it, and they'll just get in on the act. Essentially, renting it out and taking what's called key money, So, you pay the landlord for the privilege of living in a rent-controlled apartment, which is, of course, illegal, but, it's the way the landlords get it.
Well, a lot of times, too, what happens is the landlords will just write a big check to their tenant to get them out. They buy them out of the property. And, again, it's just theft. It's just the government is just stealing private property and giving it to somebody else in exchange for votes. Anyway, hey, stick around. We got another segment coming up. This is Peter Schiff on SchiffRadio.com.
The Peter Schiff Show.
To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America.
We're sorry. Peter Schiff is back on the air.
Welcome back. This is Peter Schiff on SchiffRadio.com. We're talking about urban real estate with blogger Stephen Smith of MarketUrbanism.com. Steve, one of the bigger impacts of all these the rent control laws and all the permitting processes and how difficult it is to deal with the bureaucracies is you get a lot less low cost housing. The cities in many parts of the country. The laws are always skewed in favor of the tenant against the landlord, and so people are less likely to develop. They'll deal with the tenant.
Right, and it makes it, once you price all of the low and middle class, then it becomes very easy for people to say, well, look, these developers are only building for the rich people. Perpetuating cycle, once you price out all market, people don't see it as their market. They don't really care anymore. So, great things for urbanism.
Yeah, and the government will come in and they'll... Yeah, I said, the politicians will rail that there's not enough affordable housing while they continue to pass laws to discourage people from developing those types of so difficult that the laws are so skewed in favor of the tenants. I've known people try, and then they just give up because it's too risky. And, then the tenants, and sometimes it takes forever to evict them. It's very hard to get somebody out of an apartment. I mean, kind of once they move in for a long time and pay no rent, and of course you can't even. So it's almost like they can hold you hostage. There was a movie I forget about a landlord up in San Francisco that was terrorized tenant, and of course he tried every time he tried to get him out. I mean, he couldn't do it because of law that prevented him from doing it, and it was the cops were always going after him and not the deadbeat tenant.
Yeah, San Francisco's just that. And one of the legal consequences of this is if you're a landlord, a valuable below market, apartment to rent, you do not want to break the law. Who are you going to pick? You're going to pick the poor person or the rich person? The rich tenant, they're the ones who can pay the rent on time. So once these apartments become vacant, there's absolutely no incentive for the tenant, because why would you? If the person's going to have to stay there, you someone who's going to pay the rent on time, someone who might even know the whole system.
Well, absolutely. In fact, you hope that they'll make improvements because there's no way you're going to make the improvements because you can't recoup it in rent. I mean, it's one of the reasons that you see the inner cities deteriorating because the owners of the property have no incentive to maintain the property because they can't recapture the cost of the maintenance by increased rent, so they just let them go. I remember I lived I was in Berkeley, and there was they had a lot of rent control there, and there was an apartment that we lived in, and there was a swimming pool there, but it was filled in with cement. And I know that obviously at one point there was a swimming pool, but the landlord probably said, screw it, I'm not going to maintain the swimming pool. It costs too much money, so he just filled it in with cement. And so, you just diminish the amenities because you can't raise rents. And so, so it just leads to a deterioration, a dilapidation of the housing stock because the owners, are basically removed from the equation by the government.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't really know much about the history of the South Bronx, but I hear that was a big problem. Landlords would rather literally burn their buildings down than, have to rent it at these, really low rates. I mean, theoretically, the laws allow for, raising the rents in certain cases. But, at the end of the day, what is some,
Yeah, but if you I've known plenty of people who have lived in rent-controlled apartments who have spent tens of thousands of dollars improving the properties. I mean, changing the walls, in moving, and a lot of times, you get permission from from the landlord. Sometimes they might deny it, hoping that you'll just move out and they can raise the rent if they don't. But, obviously they're the owner, and, the improvements are ultimately making the apartment more valuable at some point in the future when they can raise the rent. But some people do it without even talking to the landlord. They just, they make these improvements on their own,
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, it's basically their apartment.
Yeah, I mean, they know if they're never going to leave, and so now some people were suckered, in the housing bubble. There were some people that were living in these rent-controlled apartments, and then when the housing bubble happened and they were missing out on all the quick money, some people got tempted and decided to move out so they can buy something. Or sometimes I think some of these rent-controlled places would go condo, and they took the opportunity because they would basically give the tenants the opportunity to buy in these condo conversions, which of course they snapped up because after all they would get rich and and some people who had missed the real estate train in New York because they were living in a rent-controlled apartment, they just didn't want to buy anything. And so for years and years, they just watched real estate prices going up, and eventually they regretted it, and finally, capitulated, and bought something, and now they're probably stuck in a bad situation.
Right. I mean, in New York City, I want to say 2/3 of the rentable units are rent controlled. However, then you have this other class of, I believe in New York it's mostly co-op owners who, in the 80s and 90s exercised their rights to buy the property. And, now, even though they don't directly benefit from rent control anymore, they still, they still have an affinity for it because obviously they would have never gotten to buy their, underpriced Upper East Side apartment without it. Another problem with rent control in New York City specifically is that co-op owners, through some really bizarre tax codes, actually pay extremely low property taxes compared to everyone else because their property taxes are benchmarked against rent-controlled units. So, you have these people living in these, beautiful, 20-story pre-war buildings and, overlooking Central Park who are paying nothing in property taxes because their, property values are benchmarked against some, random rent-controlled apartment halfway across town. A lot of people in New York City benefit from it, and it's going to make it very, very difficult to repeal.
Yeah, and of course, it's always the politics. You can never just be the way it's going to be is, the mean, greedy landlord. It's like, from those movies, he's got the long mustache and he's there to pull and close. I mean, get very vilified because a lot of Americans are paying rent. They think, hey, the landlord just does nothing but collect it. So hating your landlord is probably the same, is equivalent to hating your boss. And so politicians always want to appeal to people by attacking their landlord and attacking their boss. It's a good way to get a vote, but it's not a good way to grow an economy or to grow the housing stock. Anyway, hey, thanks for being on the show. Good luck with your website. Everybody else, stick around. We got another full half-hour segment coming. Taking calls on the Peter Schiff Show at SchiffRadio.com. 855-4-SCHIFF if you want to call. We'll be back.
The Peter Schiff Show. We now return to the Peter Schiff Show. Call in now, 855-4-SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433. Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
And this is Peter Schiff on SchiffRadio.com. Anyway, during the break, I'm reading this story about the long lines in Philadelphia as a result of food stamps that are being given out. I'm assuming these are supplemental food stamps to make up supposedly for the food that was lost due to the hurricanes. Because when the hurricanes came, there were power failures, and when the power is out, your refrigerator doesn't work, and obviously some food is going to spoil in the event of a power failure. So I guess they have, as part of the disaster relief, they're offering people who have lost food due to the power failures from the hurricane that they can get some special food stamps. And, of course, what happened was the food stamp offices are overwhelmed with massive lines. The police have to come in to control the crowds. I'm reading that people are submitting claims for $600 to $800 worth of food. $600 to $800. I mean, this is an example of the moral hazard I spoke about earlier before. I mean, how much food could the typical family who is poor enough to qualify for food stamps have had in their refrigerator when the blackout hit. I mean, I'm assuming their freezer isn't filled up with thick filet mignon steaks and all kinds of, high-priced cheeses or something that might have gone bad. I mean, what do you think? Maybe the typical family spends, that's on food stamps anyway, or that's, lower income people. I mean, what do you figure they spend a week? Family of 3 or 4 people, maybe $125 a week. That'd be my guess, what they would spend on food. And most people probably shop every week, right? You're not doing your grocery marketing for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. I mean, you're probably going to go to the market once a week, I'm assuming, typically. And that's about what they're spending. And not all that is going in the freezer and the refrigerator. A lot of that is, non-perishable items, box of cornflakes, coffee, different things that they're buying. It's not going to spoil. A jar of peanut butter. I mean, this stuff isn't going to spoil. So, you got some milk in there that might go bad. Maybe there might be some ice cream in there. Maybe you have some chicken in the freezer or some steaks. But, of course, when the power goes out, you don't immediately lose all the food in your refrigerator. I mean, some of the things that are frozen, it takes a while to defrost. I mean, you can certainly eat some of the food. I mean, I had the power. My power was out for 2 or 3 days. I'm not sure if anything spoiled this time. I know I had a power outage about a year and a half ago. I lost power for a week, and I think a lot of things spoiled. But, I mean, I didn't lose $600 worth of food, $800 worth of food. And, I think I had a freezer that had a lot of stuff in it. But here you have people showing up. I mean, realistically, you would think that the most anybody really lost was maybe $50 worth of food, if they even lost that, right? If they lost that food, if the stuff that they couldn't eat before it spoiled. Yet they're coming in here and they're asking for $600 to $800. So what that means is whatever the bureaucrats budgeted, let's say the bureaucrats probably said, okay, let's let the people who lost some food due to the hurricane, let's give them some money, and they probably figured how many families had blackouts, how much food did they likely lose, and they probably came up with some amount of money that they assumed it was going to cost based on how much money they thought people lost. But what they didn't calculate was how people were going to lie and exaggerate the amount of their damages so that they can qualify for more free money. That's what people do. I mean, because how are you going to prove it? You think they saved their receipts? So you can say, well, show me the receipts. Well, I don't save my grocery receipts. I didn't realize that there was going to be a power failure and the food was going to spoil. So, no, I don't have any. How are you going to ask for receipts? So you can't prove. I mean, whatever they say they had in the refrigerator, I mean, there's nothing you can do. You just got to, if they say it, you just got to pay the money. And so now there's so many people coming for the benefits. I think I'm reading that they're extending the time limit to qualify because so many people want it. And once you find out, hey, somebody got $800 to cover the food that they lost during the hurricane, everybody is going to line up to get all this free money. I mean, the whole thing is not. It's just a government grab bag. It's just whenever there's a natural disaster now, it's just an opportunity. Another reason. I mean, all this is probably going through FEMA. I'm assuming. I don't know if it's just a special thing for the food stamps, but it's just one big grab bag for political pork, and they declare the disaster a town a disaster area. I mean, in fact, that's what everybody wants. I mean, that's what you want. You want to be a disaster area because the minute the government declares you a disaster area, it's a smorgasbord. It's Christmas. Everybody gets whatever they want. It's all kinds of free stuff, and no one bothers it. Where's this money coming from? Who's paying the cost for all these families to get $600 and $800 checks? Because they may have potentially lost a few bucks worth of food due to a power outage. I don't know, crazy stuff. Anyway, let me go take a call. Travis is on hold from Phoenix, Arizona. Travis, welcome to the show.
Hey, Peter, how you doing? Quick question for you. The question about mining stocks. I know that in Crash Brief you recommended that whenever you want to purchase or research mining stocks, that you recommend doing so on the foreign stock exchanges, which I did so for quite a few stocks that you referred to there. The only two that I couldn't find that were directly on the foreign stock exchange were Harmony, which appeared to have no real good equivalent other than being on the ADR, and Goldfield Limited, which was on the EDS. And when I talked to my broker about this, he mentioned that Europac is required by the SEC to purchase these on as an ADR on the United States Stock Exchange. for liquidity purposes. So it sounds like they're even regulating you to make you buy foreign stocks as an ADR.
Well, we're not required to, we can, that's just not true. But for the stocks that you're mentioning, when the stocks are more liquid in New York than they are in their foreign exchange, there's no reason not to buy them here. I mean, there are plenty of Canadian companies trading in the U.S. and South African companies trading in the U.S. where it's perfectly fine to buy the ADRs if you want to buy those stocks. I mean, if you've got an exchange-listed ADR, the ones that are problematic are where they trade over the counter on the pink sheets. That's when you want to avoid them. But there are plenty of legitimately traded ADRs on exchanges that are very liquid, that have narrow spreads, and there's no reason that you can't buy them. You're still buying a foreign stock. You're just buying its depository receipt here. But there's nothing that mandates that you do it. But the way we do get hurt by the regulators is maybe on the state level, because the states, in order for me to recommend a stock, it has to be blue-skied in that state. That's a rule. And so what happens is anything pretty much that's going to be listed in the U.S. automatically is going to be blue-skied. But if the stock is not listed in the U.S., then we have to make sure that it has qualified under one of the various exemptions for blue sky. And what's very frustrating to me as a broker is a lot of times some of my favorite stocks, some of the stocks that I think are the best buys for my clients, don't meet the blue sky requirement. And so I am not allowed to recommend them. So let's say a client calls up and they say, hey, I want to buy a foreign utility. Which one is your favorite? And let's say my favorite utility is one that the government says I can't recommend. It depends on what state you live in. But based on these blue sky laws, let's say the one I like the best, I can't tell you about because I'm not allowed to. And let's say the one I like the second best, I can't tell you about. Maybe I have to go down to the one I like the third or the fourth best, and that's the one the government says that's okay for me to solicit. So I can't give my client my best idea. I can only give my client the best idea that the government lets me tell them. And so all of this theoretically is in there to protect the investor, but why would he need to be protected if I'm trying to give him my advice and there's a stock that I think is the best one to buy, represents the best value, maybe I think has the least risk, has the best dividend, most upside potential, but just because it doesn't qualify for the blue sky requirement in their state, I can't recommend it. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. But if they want to buy it unsolicited, then it doesn't, so if someone just calls up out of the blue and says, buy me this stock, then it doesn't have to be blue sky. But in order for me to recommend it, it has to, and we spend a lot of money tracking all of our stocks, making sure they're blue skied. And again, sometimes it's frustrating that one of my favorite stocks all of a sudden is blue skied one day, and then something happens and it's no longer blue skied, so I can't recommend it anymore. Which is, but for a mutual fund, let's say somebody buys a mutual fund, that mutual fund can buy any of these stocks. So if you invest in a foreign mutual fund, that mutual fund can buy any stock for that fund, whether or not it's blue sky or not, it doesn't matter. So if I'm a mutual fund manager, I can buy stocks that aren't blue skied for my clients. But if I'm a stock broker, I can't recommend stocks that are not blue skied, but I can recommend that they buy a mutual fund that buys those exact same stocks. I mean, so all these laws and rules and regulations are complex, costly, and ultimately undermine the investment advice that is given to Americans. And, of course, a lot of Americans don't even get any investment advice because the small investor is pretty much persona non grata at just about every firm on Wall Street because the government has made it so risky and so expensive to deal with small investors that no one will do it. So then, again, that's another example of an unintended consequence where the government wants to protect the little guy from these greedy Wall Street firms, and so they pass all these rules and regulations to protect the little guy, and now it's so expensive that nobody will even open up an account for the little guy. So now the little guy is totally on his own, picking stocks at a discount broker, and is he really better off? I mean, in some cases maybe, but I think that that small investors who are working hard, who don't know a lot about investing but are trying to invest some money because they have another job, I think they'd be better off with professional help than having to do it all on their own. But because of the government, they no longer have the ability to get professional help because no professionals will help them.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I appreciate that. It sounded to me like you were saying in the book, hey, foreign stock exchanges or foreign stocks denominated in foreign currencies, like, yes, on the ASX or on the TSE, the Canadian and Australian dollar
Well, that's in the circumstance because most of the companies that I like don't have an ADR. So the only way to buy them is to buy them directly on their exchanges, because these are the companies that deal mainly outside the U.S. Most of the companies that are listed here are big multinationals, and so they have a lot of exposure here to the U.S. market. But hey, if you want to stick on like this, I'll finish up with this point after the break. You're listening to the Peter Schiff Show on SchiffRadio.com.
The Peter Schiff Show. Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million.
Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
Hey, this is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. We finally got to the final segment. Unfortunately, now we have a full board of calls. Not going to be able to get to everybody, though, I don't think. It's not a lot of time. But I wanted to finish up the call with Travis from Arizona. Yeah, my point in my book, Travis, was that most of the stocks that I like, as far as the foreign stocks that I think are the best positioned to benefit from the realignment of the global economy as Americans consume less and the emerging markets consume more and they no longer prop us up, most of those companies that I think are the best don't even have a listed ADR. To the extent that there is a company with a listed ADR, if you want to buy that ADR, it's perfectly fine because it should have liquidity and a narrow spread. But most of these foreign stocks that I do like, it is possible to buy them in the U.S. With over the counter. And generally these stocks will have 5-letter symbols that will end in F or Y. But the problem is when you buy them in that manner, there's very little liquidity, and the spreads are very wide. So I think it's very dangerous for people to trade foreign stocks through these pink sheets over the counter. And so that's when I'm saying you want to try to buy them directly on the foreign exchanges, either through me or through somebody else. A discount. Some of the discount brokers now, a lot more so than when I wrote my book, do allow access at a higher fee to foreign exchanges. So if you're going to buy them on the foreign exchange, you got to make sure you're going there, not through the market makers, and you got to figure out what your fees are.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and that does make sense. Those mining stocks, basically, that you listed in Cash Proof, all of them do have their, like I said, Toronto Stock Exchange or Australian stock.
Yeah, I mean, if you get a big stock, you get a big stock, like that's a Canadian company, like let's say like a Gold Corp. I'm not recommending. I'm just using an example. These big liquid Canadian companies that are duly listed in the U.S. and Canada. It doesn't matter where you buy them. There's no reason for you to go and buy them in Toronto. You can buy them in New York. I mean, there are people that will try to arbitrage between the two. And so that's really what prevents, the professional arbs who are trading, they'll prevent the prices from really getting too out of whack. But yeah, when there is a very liquid ADR, if you want to buy the stock anyway, and it's a liquid ADR, there is no reason to buy it on the foreign exchange. In fact, when we buy those stocks for our clients, we buy them here. We don't go because it actually would be more expensive to do the FX and go and buy on the Toronto exchange. So it doesn't make any sense. But where it is less expensive to buy the ordinary shares, then we do that.
Gotcha.
But where it's cheaper to buy the ADRs, we do that as well. All right. Hey, thanks for your call. Hey, I wanted to play, before I try to get to some of these callers, I want to play a series of clips from Barack Obama. This is Barack Obama appearing on Black Entertainment Television, being asked persistently from the host of the show, what is Barack Obama going to do to help the African-American community? And here's how Barack Obama is trying to answer that question. Here, cut number 3.
You've just announced a new $447 billion jobs bill, right? And we all know that African-American unemployment is running really, really high, above 16%, nearly double that of whites. How does this bill specifically target them?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that we are going through the worst financial crisis and subsequent economy that we've seen since the Great Depression. And so the challenges for everybody out there is tough. You're right. It's especially tough for the African-American community.
So he's asking him a question. Forget about the merits of the president's jobs bill. Let's pretend for a moment that it's actually going to create jobs, which it's not going to do. But let's pretend that it does. He's saying, hey, we have a lot of unemployed African Americans. How does your jobs bill help them? Well, if they're unemployed and this bill is to create jobs, doesn't that mean it's going to help the African Americans? Because there's more unemployment in the African American community, right? That's what he's saying, than in the white community. So then wouldn't a bill to create jobs automatically just help blacks? I mean, doesn't it go without saying? But, he's not satisfied. Here, in cut number 4.
So the jobs bill overall is designed to make sure that we're rebuilding schools and bridges and putting construction workers back to work. It makes sure that we're putting teachers back in the classroom. It makes certain that we are providing incentives to hire veterans who have been out of work, but also the long-term unemployed who are out of work. And it makes sure that we're providing tax breaks and tax credits to just about every family and every middle-class person and every small business around the country. Now, with respect to the African-American community, they benefit from all of that.
So, again, the president is wrong on the fact that his bill is going to help the unemployed, but he's right on one thing, that if it really was going to help the unemployed, that blacks would benefit the same as whites, right? He's trying to say that I don't need to have a special jobs bill just for blacks. In fact, I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip the next one. Let me just go to cut number 6. Cut to the chase here. Play cut 6.
Why not target the African American community? Why not say then, this is for you? This is for African Americans. If there was a banking crisis, then you target money for the banks. If there was a national disaster, you target your money for the national for disaster relief.
That's not how America works. America works when all of us are pulling together, and everybody is focused on making sure that every single person has opportunity.
So what does this guy want? What does he want President Obama to do when he says we want a jobs program targeted to the African American community? So he wants special, maybe a special tax credit that says if you hire an African American, that you get a special tax credit as opposed to hiring somebody who's not African American. I mean, he wants specific jobs, a bill that is focused, that's legally on blacks that are unemployed and not whites. I mean, he wants to make the program race specific. How's he supposed to do that? Wouldn't it? How would he feel if there was a jobs program aimed at whites? Oh, but he wants to specifically make it racially based, as if they could do. Yeah, here's an incentive. We want to make sure that if you have 2 applicants, one's white and one's black, we're going to give you a special tax credit if you hire the black person. Or we want to create government jobs, and we're only going to accept applications from blacks. Is that what he wants? Is that what he's asking the president to do? I mean, I wish Obama would have been stronger and put it right back in his face. But, there are things that the president can do that could specifically help the black community, but he doesn't want to go there, right? He doesn't want to address the minimum wage, which adversely affects disproportionately but African Americans more than white Americans. He doesn't want to go with the laws against racial discrimination that make it so much more expensive to hire African Americans, that make it less likely that someone's going to take a chance at hiring somebody when they know they risk a lawsuit for doing it. He doesn't want to go there. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Don't forget to tune in again tomorrow for another 2 hours of the Peter Schiff Show on SchiffRadio.com. And to the callers who are still on hold, next time, call earlier. Anyway, that's it for today.
The Peter Schiff Show.